Hi, I'm Paradise, and together with Shannon and Christina, we will be examining Mr. Green's case study. This was originally presented by the International Journal of Nursing Sciences. Healthcare professionals face more and more ethical dilemmas in today's high-paced dynamic medical field. We will summarize the facts of Mr. Green's case, identify and analyze the ethical issue of the case study, and apply ethical framework to resolve the ethical issue. Mr. Green is a patient who was diagnosed with a severe form of prostate cancer 7 years ago, and initially he refused treatment. Instead, he chose to seek alternative medicine and discontinued treatment with his urologist. Over time, his condition worsened, and several tests determined that the cancer had metastasized to his bones and his lymph nodes, with a primary tumor residing in his bladder. He is currently being cared for by the oncology department's nursing team in a general hospital. Mr. Green had been admitted several times within the last 2 months for various symptoms, and on the last admission, Mr. Green was told that he may only have 4 to 6 weeks to live. The tumor had further grown, and it was determined that any future medical intervention would not benefit the patient, leaving palliative care as the next step. At this point, the patient reported to the healthcare team that he had come to terms with his eventual death. Mr. Green also confided to a nurse that he planned to end his life and requested that the nurse tell no one.
Hi guys, I'm Shannon, and I'm going to be discussing the issues of this case with you, and most of the issues are ethical. So in this case, we have an ethical dilemma on our hands, and an ethical dilemma occurs when two ethical principles conflict with each other. You're faced with a decision with two options, and both of the options are not entirely morally acceptable. So if you pick either option, you're going to be violating an ethical principle. The ethical dilemma in this case is whether or not the nurse should tell other staff members about Mr. Green's suicide plans. So first, we're just going to look at the ethical principles that are involved in the case and how they play into the dilemma, and that'll help us decide which option is most ethically acceptable and benefits Mr. Green the most. So the two main principles involved in this case are beneficence and autonomy. Just to recap, beneficence is defined by our text as the principle of doing good, demonstrating kindness, showing compassion, helping others. Interestingly enough, paternalism falls under that umbrella of beneficence. It's considered a form of beneficence. Paternalism involves holding information from a person based on the belief that it's to their benefit. And medical paternalism involves making choices or forcing those choices on patients, even though they can make their own decisions, again, based on the thought that it's for their own benefit. And another extension of beneficence that can be included in this case is non-malfeasance, which is just avoiding causing harm to patients. The next ethical principle in this case is autonomy. And autonomy is recognizing the right of a person to make their own decisions. Competent patients have the right to make informed medical decisions. And we saw this earlier in the case when Mr. Green exercised his right to refuse care when he was initially diagnosed with cancer. Okay, so now that we've covered the ethical principles in the case, let's look at the ethical dilemma itself. The nurse has two exclusive, somewhat morally correct choices. She can keep the patient's secret, which upholds autonomy and violates beneficence, where she can tell her coworkers about Mr. Green's suicide plans, violating autonomy and upholding beneficence. So in the healthcare arena, one of the most important obligations of the nursing staff is to promote the health and well-being of their patients. This means that the nursing staff has to consider what actions are better for their patients. Applying beneficence to the ethical dilemma in Mr. Green's case, the nurse has to consider the question, which choice will be better for Mr. Green? The beneficence principle requires nursing staff to do everything to promote patients' health and maintain patient safety. It's obvious that the nursing staff has to tell other healthcare professionals about Mr. Green's self-harm attempt so that healthcare intervention team can prevent the suicide attempt and fulfill the beneficence principle. This action also involves employing medical paternalism because the nurse is making a decision on Mr. Green's behalf based on the belief that it's in his best interest for his safety, even though he's completely capable of making the decision himself. It's also important when applying the principle of beneficence to any case, and non-malfeasance for that matter, to consider the patient's own perspective. So in Mr. Green's case, he's going to think that the greatest benefit would be allowing him to die, but a nurse's behavior of keeping silent would not be considered as harmful from his perspective. So now that we've explored the choices the nurse can make to uphold beneficence, let's observe the paths she can take to uphold autonomy. Now, autonomy is a right for all patients, and the nursing staff must respect patient confidentiality and confirm that the staff's actions have the informed consent of their patients to uphold autonomy. By applying autonomy to Mr. Green's case, the choice of keeping the secret respects the patient's right of self-determination. However, the choice of keeping Mr. Green's secret would ignore the patient's potential suicide and would lead to patient self-harm behavior. According to the International Journal of Nursing Sciences, cancer patients are much more likely to seek assistance with dying. And behavior of nursing staff that is classified as assisted dying practices is refraining from interventions to prevent or dissuade the patient from taking his or her life. In Mr. Green's case, the choice of keeping the secret can be classified into assisted dying practices. Therefore, autonomy cannot be upheld in law regarding euthanasia and assisted suicide, as people don't have the right to be assisted to die at any time they choose. Therefore, although Mr. Green's autonomy should be respected, it cannot override the common law, which identifies that professionals' behavior of assisted dying is illegal. The International Journal of Nursing Sciences also pointed out that patients in special situations making irresponsible decisions with severe consequences to themselves or others should have their wishes overturned by healthcare professionals, even if it's against their will. In Mr. Green's case, the suicide attempt can be identified as a decision which causes serious self-harm. Consequently, Mr. Green's autonomy can be overridden in order to avoid his suicide attempt. In addition, the assessment of Mr. Green's current situation when he made the decision is needed, because some research emphasized that patients with mental disorder or unstable emotional conditions cannot be considered as competent individuals that can make their own medical decisions. And now Christina is going to talk about why upholding beneficence is the right decision.
I'm going to analyze if the nurse made the right decision in choosing beneficence over autonomy. Just to recap, autonomy is respecting the patient's wishes, whereas beneficence is doing good and benefiting the patients and preventing harm. I believe that she made the right choice to go with the ethical principle of beneficence, because if the patient were to commit the suicide, he could have harmed other patients, damaged hospital equipment, he could have disturbed the mental states of some of the other patients, and it would have really caused a lot of harm to a lot of people in the hospital. Now, also, if the nurse were not to say anything, she could have been an accessory to his suicide, which isn't legal. She would be really an asset to it if she weren't not to tell anyone. And in this case, I feel the right decision was made to follow the law. And also, at the same time, she'd be preventing harm to others. Now, especially if they live in a state where physician-assisted suicide isn't legal, then she could be in even more trouble. And even if the state had laws saying physician-assisted suicide was okay, then she still should have informed them, because that is a decision for the whole healthcare team to talk about, so that the suicide could be done in a safe manner, not harming other patients or disturbing the mental states of staff and family members that may be at the hospital. She is choosing to use kind of a deontological ethics. She has a duty to prevent harm, and she's preventing him from harming himself and potentially harming others. So in this case, I really think that it was okay for that nurse to go over the top of his autonomy. And we still haven't even had his mental state checked. Maybe it needs to be to see if he's really in the right place to be making or saying these decisions about taking his own life.